Yes, that's fine. Yeah, I'll remove it. Yep.
Okay, I'll be standing off on the side.
Well, or you and I, or I could wander. Yeah.
Just sit at the front.
Yeah. Yeah. Good evening, everybody. My name is David Schwartz. I am the president of the Men's Club. I am assisted by John Silver and Constantine Kleiner of the Executive Committee. Our next event is on March 23rd on our movie night, when we will be showing the film Bombshell, about the life and career of the hailed Hollywood movie star and underappreciated genius inventor Hedy Lamarr. You've heard of GPS? That's her. Before we bring up, no, that's old. Professor Emeritus Chris Friedrichs of UBC, a well-known and very popular speaker at Temple Sholom and longtime member here, will be speaking about Jerusalem in the forgotten centuries. We will have a question and answer session after Chris's talk, and then everyone is welcome to join us in the social hall for refreshments.
So the first thing a speaker always says is, "Can you hear me?" Okay, well, good. Second thing is, I hope you find it worthwhile to hear me. We'll find out. So I want to begin by just saying that I should say something about why this topic is something I have found interesting to learn about, and therefore I hope you will find interesting to learn about as well. I have a number of interests as a historian. Many of them have to do with German Jewish history. Many of you know, I have an interest in the history of the Holocaust. But another field of interest of mine has been the history of cities in Europe and elsewhere in pre-modern times. And this talk, in many ways, arises from that interest. It also has to do with the fact that I've been fortunate to be in Jerusalem on 6 separate occasions, either to visit friends and relatives or to participate in conferences and so on. So it's a city that I have some acquaintance with, and I'm sure that applies to very many people in this room. I know that very many of you have been to Jerusalem, but I better explain the phrase forgotten centuries, because that could be misunderstood. Jerusalem has never been forgotten by Jews, by Christians, or by Muslims. For Jews, the reasons Jerusalem has never been forgotten is so obvious, I don't have to go into that. But you have to remember that it's the same for Christians, because crucial events in the life of Jesus, the most crucial events in the life of Jesus, took place in Jerusalem. That's where Jesus and his disciples had the last Passover meal that Jesus had, which is known among Christians as the Last Supper, but it was his last Passover. That's where Jesus was put on trial. That's where Jesus was executed by crucifixion. These are all things, there's general agreement. These things happened in Jerusalem. Among Christians, in Christian belief, Jerusalem was also where 3 days after Jesus died and was buried, he was resurrected. So Christians attribute enormous importance to Jerusalem. And the same goes for Muslims. Among Muslims, it's very widely believed among Muslims that an important, miraculous event in the life of Muhammad took place in Jerusalem, right on what we would call the Temple Mount. And I'll say a little more about that later on. But now, if you go to Jerusalem, many of us have been to Jerusalem. If you travel to Jerusalem today, most of what you read or hear about the city's history is about Jerusalem in biblical times, in Roman times, in ancient times. All the archaeology focuses on discovering bits of Jerusalem's past from biblical times and from the Roman era and so on. And Jerusalem's history in the last 100 years has been so complex and so significant, really, from every point of view, that the way Jerusalem has evolved in the last 100 years is also something that people are very aware of. But what about the period in between? What about the period between the biblical and Roman times and the last 100 years? Those are periods that are often forgotten in the historical imagination that people have about Jerusalem. Those are the forgotten centuries. Most of us don't know nearly so much about Jerusalem in those long centuries when it was basically, except for 100 years when the European Crusaders took over, for 1,000 years or more, Jerusalem was under the control of various branches of various Muslim rulers. And that's not a period about which so much thought is given. That's what I mean when I say Jerusalem in the forgotten centuries, centuries we don't talk about very much. And tonight we're going to talk about them. At least I'm going to talk about them, and you may also talk about them when there's a question period. So now we all know where Jerusalem is. But it's interesting that for many people, especially in Europe, they had a different perception of where Europe was. And take a look at this rather well-known map of the world in a book that was published in Germany, in an atlas that was published in Germany in 1493. This was a year after Columbus, but no one in Germany knew that Columbus had made contact with a whole section of the world that Columbus himself didn't realize he'd made contact with. So this is the vision of the world, and at the very center of the world was Jerusalem. And it's a wonderful indication of how central Jerusalem was in the imagination of Christian Europeans, as an example, in the late Middle Ages. This sense that Jerusalem was enormously important. It was at the center of the world. So Jerusalem is a very old city. It's a city that's about 3,000 years old. I'm tempted to say about this list, it'll be on the exam. Oops, I'm retired from that stuff. But anyway, and I'm not going to go through this all, but you're all familiar with the fact that Jerusalem had numerous rulers of one sort or other all through the centuries. But in the period I'm going to focus on is this period, the time when it was following the Crusader century, when European Crusaders got control of Jerusalem for a while. There were a number of different Muslim rulers, and then the most important ones were the Ottomans, who controlled that part of the world and much else for basically for 400 years. And that's the period of the so-called forgotten centuries that I am going to be focusing on in the next 45 or 50, or I hope not much more than 50 minutes, we'll see. So here is Jerusalem as it looks today. Many of us have been to Jerusalem, and some people may have flown over Jerusalem. Would no doubt have been very spectacular experience. It's a very large city now. But you should keep in mind that for most of Jerusalem's history, the people who lived in Jerusalem lived in this area, the area that roughly corresponds to what's referred to today as the Old City. The exact boundaries changed. The walls moved at certain points. There was some more settlement, a little to the south, a little to the north, or whatever. But this was Jerusalem for most of the 3,000 years that it has existed since it was founded in the time of David 3,000 years ago. Jerusalem today is something much bigger than it was for almost all of its human history. But Jerusalem, as you know, is surrounded by various hills. If you've been to Jerusalem, you know, you look out and you see all the Judean hills surrounding Jerusalem, and there's hills and valleys and so on. And throughout these hills and valleys, there were numerous religious shrines, places venerated by Jews or Muslims or Christians, or sometimes by Jews and Muslims, or by Jews and Christians, or Christians. You know, these places had different meanings and significance. And sometimes people lived in those shrines as caretakers and so on. So there were people living around Jerusalem, but the numbers were really very small. For most of its city history, that is what Jerusalem was. So here is the area that we know as the Old City. And the most important religious sites of all three religions are, in fact, in the Old City. The Haram, in Muslim terms, it's the Haram. Among Jews, of course, is what we would refer to as the Temple Mount. And Christians also refer to it as the Temple Mount, of course. This was significant because it was the site of the temple of the Jews in ancient times, the temple built by Solomon, and the successive temples of later times. It is now the site of two very important Muslim shrines, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. The Haram, the Temple Mount, is surrounded by a wall, and that wall corresponds to the wall of the temple enclosure of ancient times. And the western part of that wall has survived and is a very significant Jewish holy site, which if you've been to Jerusalem, you almost certainly have been to the Kotel and you've seen that. And the most important Christian site is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is really one of the most important Christian shrines in the world. And in the course of what I'm talking about, I will mention all of these sites. So let's start with the temple. So there was the temple built at the time of Solomon, and then the temple was destroyed at the time when the Babylonians came and removed many of the Jews to Babylonia. And then after a certain period of generations, Jews returned to Jerusalem, as you know, and a second temple was built on exactly the same site. And then at the time of King Herod, that temple was significantly expanded and reconstructed. Sometimes people even refer to it as the third temple. That was the temple at the time that Jesus was in Jerusalem. That's the temple he visited, and he made a big fuss there by overthrowing the tables of the money changers and so on. It's one of the things that was significant in that rather busy week that Jesus experienced in roughly the year 33 of the Common Era. So the temple, as you know, in the year 70 of the Common Era, there was a great Jewish rebellion against the Romans because the Herodian rulers were really ruling at the with the permission of the Romans, who were the real rulers of that part of the world. And there was a Jewish uprising against the Romans. The Romans won. They destroyed the temple. They kept the temple, the huge Temple Mount was still a big area surrounded by walls, but the Romans destroyed the temple in the year 70, and a Roman temple was, of course, built there instead of the temple of Herod, or the temple of Solomon. And then when the Roman Empire fell apart, or rather was transformed into the Byzantine Empire, the eastern part of the Roman Empire survived as the Byzantine Empire. There was then a church built up there. But then in the 1630s, something very important happened. Muhammad founded Islam in the 1630s, and very soon after Muhammad's career, really within a decade or so, Arab armies started spreading out and bringing their doctrine to other parts of the world and conquering. They conquered Palestine, and very soon after that, they built two very important structures on what had been the Temple Mount. One is a mosque, not surprising. They would build a mosque. It became one of the most important mosques in the Muslim world. And the other was the Dome of the Rock. And that was placed over a rock, which in the belief of many Muslims was the spot where Muhammad, during his career, had a miraculous experience. In Islamic belief, he was standing on that rock. He came to Jerusalem to venerate Jerusalem because, you know, Islam it draws on the Jewish and Christian traditions and some of its teachings. And while he was standing on that rock, he was miraculously taken to heaven and saw God, Allah, and then was returned to earth, and that's a great miracle in Islamic belief. So they built this structure, this shrine, to commemorate an important event in the history of the Prophet. You all know that and I mentioned it already, the Western Wall has survived, a section of the original wall of the Temple Mount. It's always been venerated by Jews who, you know, have not been able to worship in the temple since the temple hasn't existed since the year 70. But actually, for hundreds and hundreds of years, it was not the main place. I mean, Jews worshipped in synagogues, and synagogues were founded in Jerusalem. But the other place Jews went was the Mount of Olives, where there were Jewish graves. And that was for centuries the most important place where Jews went to pray beyond praying in their own synagogues. But there emerged over the centuries a problem of bandits in this area, and going out of the carefully walled city to pray at the Mount of Olives could mean you might be attacked by bandits and so on. So it became more and more customary at a certain point to do the praying here at the Western Wall, and that became a very important Jewish tradition, which of course still exists. And the most important Christian shrine, which I mentioned, but I want to talk about, and you'll be hearing quite a bit about, is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is built a group of churches that are more or less merged into a single church, which marks the spot where very important events in the life of Jesus are thought to have taken place. The crucifixion. Then when Jesus' body was taken down from the cross, it was buried in a cave just right there. And then in Christian belief, 3 days later, miraculously, Jesus emerged from the tomb and was resurrected, and this is what the Easter celebrated by Christians is all about. So it was not surprising that the shrine or church would be built there. The problem in Jerusalem was that there were numerous different branches of Christianity represented in Jerusalem. There were the Greek Orthodox, the Armenians, the Syrians, the Coptics, the Latin Christians from Western Europe, and so many more. And they all felt they had the right to worship and at the site of this most important place in Christian belief. But they didn't get along with each other. And there were constant controversies and conflicts within this church. If you go to the church today, it's an interesting sight. You'll see that there is, on the upper left, the upper right-hand picture is the actual shrine that is supposed to be where it is believed the tomb of Jesus was. But there were all sorts of other little chapels and big chapels and little special shrines and so on, each controlled by clergy people of a different branch of Christianity. The Coptics are controlled something, the Armenians control something, the Ethiopians, the Latin, the Franciscans control something, and they for centuries have not gotten along with each other, and there's always arguments and fights and so on. In the long period when Jerusalem was controlled by Muslim rulers, when they couldn't stop fighting about this, the Muslim rulers would have to step in and say, you're going to do this here, you're going to keep out of that chapel because it belongs to the Coptics and so on. Today, by the way, they're still having these arguments, and it's now the Israeli Ministry of Religious Affairs that has to settle the disputes that are still going on in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre about who has the right to control which shrine and which altar and so forth and so on. But it's a very important site in Jerusalem for people who happen to be Christians. So it's a long period of Muslim control interrupted by the Crusades, but I'm going to be focused mostly on the period following the time when for about a century Crusaders from Europe controlled Jerusalem. And very soon after the last Crusaders were kicked out of Jerusalem, there was some stuff going on which I can't summarize. A very powerful group called the Mamluks, who were the rulers of Egypt, conquered Arabia and the Levant, the area around Palestine and what's now Lebanon and Syria and so on. They controlled this whole area you see on the map, and that meant, among other things, they controlled Jerusalem. The Mamluks were the rulers of Egypt for hundreds of years, and then they were gradually threatened by a new, even more powerful group, the Ottoman Turks, whose base was, surprise, surprise, in Turkey. And when this map, the period referred to in this map, the Ottomans were in Turkey, but they had their eye on expanding their power, and they were very, very significant military power. And I have to mention the name because they're both very important in the history of Jerusalem, of two major Ottoman sultans. One is Selim I. His nickname, for some reason, was Selim the Grim, but he wasn't grim from the Ottoman Turk point of view because he was a brilliant military tactician, and he and his armies managed to conquer Syria, conquer Palestine, get control of Jerusalem, go on, conquer Egypt, throw out the Mamluks, and all of what had been part of the Mamluk Sultanate became part of the Ottoman Empire within a few years. When he died, he was succeeded by his son Suleiman, and referred to generally as Suleiman the Magnificent, because he really had the most, from the Ottoman point of view, the most magnificent reign in Ottoman history. And he was a very effective conqueror as well. But what he was conquering, his father had already done the job for him of conquering Syria and Palestine and Egypt and so on. He proceeded to conquer much of the Balkan Peninsula and much of Mesopotamia, the area that's now Iraq. The great city of Baghdad came under his control and so on. So the Ottoman Empire looked roughly like this in the period of the greatest years of the Ottoman Empire, the 16th and 17th century. And this is a few of the important cities of the Ottoman Empire. Istanbul was the capital, formerly known as Constantinople, and before that known as Byzantium and so on. But anyway, and being the capital of this great empire, it had a huge population, 1 million people. Aleppo was one of many important commercial cities, and there were cities of great commercial importance in the Ottoman Empire. There was Damascus, there was Baghdad, there was Aleppo, which had a population of 100,000. Cairo, which had previously been the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate, had a population of about 400,000. Jerusalem, the great city of Jerusalem that means so much to so many people, had about 10,000. It was a very small city. It had shrunk. Its commercial and economic importance had totally disappeared. It was a remnant of a great city. And that's one of the things we have to think about. What this wall is about seems discordant when you think that Jerusalem was a city of only 10,000 population. But Suleiman the Magnificent was as a devout Muslim, attached great importance to Jerusalem. And he felt that a city of such great religious importance, even if it had lost all its commercial and economic importance, should be like any other important city in the pre-modern world, in most parts of the world, and cities had to have walls around them to protect them. And Jerusalem, of all places, should have a proper wall. Now, all his life, he wanted to make a pilgrimage from Istanbul to Jerusalem. He never really got around to doing that. But he studied pictures and maps and plans and decided that Jerusalem must have a wall, and the wall must encompass all of the shrines and the chapels and so on, whatever it might have been, surrounding the more densely populated inner section, because by the time of Suleiman the Magnificent, Jerusalem's walls had disappeared. One segment was still there, but most of the walls had deteriorated, and there wasn't enough wealth to repair them. And he said, I'll fix that. And he, being a very wealthy ruler provided the funds and studied the maps and gave instructions. Everything around Jerusalem, not just the densely populated inner city, but all the area with all the special shrines and so forth, so-called City of David and so on, to be surrounded by a wall. Well, his architects got to work on it, and if any of you have been to Jerusalem, you know what an impressive wall they built. But when Suleiman got the reports, he was furious, because the architects and the engineers had realized that enclosing all of Jerusalem with all those shrines, you know, that great slope that slopes down from Jerusalem would have created no end of engineering problems and so on. They really just enclosed the densely populated inner city, what we now call the Old City. And Suleiman was furious. He said, "You didn't obey my orders." And it's widely reported that he ordered the execution of the architect and the engineer because they hadn't obeyed his order. Anyway, one way or other, the wall survived. And Suleiman went on ruling for 45 years, but he never got around to visiting Jerusalem. And this was maybe a disappointment to him. But it's actually very important to think about what was Jerusalem like in those years. Who actually lived in this small, this town that was barely qualified as a city? Who really lived there inside these massive walls? That's quite interesting. Only about, as I said, only about 10,000 people lived in Jerusalem. Most of them were Muslims, not surprisingly, Arabs. They were not Ottomans, they were Arabs. This part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire subordinated also to people who were not Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans spoke Turkish. The Arabs spoke Arabic. And they were among the subordinated populations of the Ottoman Empire. So there were about 8,000 Muslims, about 1,000 Christians, and I've already mentioned this, the Greek Orthodox, the Armenians, the so-called Latins, the Syrians, the Georgians, the Ethiopians. And very many of these 1,000 Christians were actually members of the clergy or closely connected with monasteries and so on. I mean, they had to, you know, your day job may have been tending an altar in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but you had to have a place to eat and sleep and live, and there were these monasteries and hostels and so on. There were Christians, and then there were about 1,000 Jews in Jerusalem. The Jews were not they were a highly varied group, let's put it that way. There were an enormous variety just 1,000, you know, there's 30,000 Jews in Greater Vancouver, right? There were only 1,000 Jews in historic Jerusalem in the 16th and 17th century. At one point it went up a little bit, but basically the main group were the indigenous Jews, the ones whose families had lived in that area for hundreds of years, or maybe thousands of years as far as one can tell. And like most Jewish populations in history, they adopted the dominant language. Their language was Arabic. Hebrew was the religious language. Their everyday language was, of course, Arabic. There were the arriving group were the Sephardic Jews, who were the Jews who were kicked out of Spain after 1492 by Ferdinand and Isabella and spread out all over the Mediterranean, including those who came to Palestine, and a number of them came to Jerusalem. There were Ashkenazic Jews from Europe, from Central and Eastern Europe. And often they were older Jews who had made their fortune or made some wealth and wanted to spend their last years in Jerusalem and be buried on the Mount of Olives, and this was a thing that many pious Jews did. There were also a fair number of North African Jews who spoke Arabic, Italian Jews who arrived there speaking Italian, Jews who spoke Greek, and so on. So the Jews were a very mixed group. That 1,000 Jews included all these different groups, but there were community institutions that really managed the Jewish community. Now, the Jews and the Christians as in most Muslim cities historically, in the time where there were various Muslim empires of one sort or other, and in India, the Mughal Empire and so on, the general practice was that the rulers accepted that there would be other religious groups, They did not try to convert everyone, but the other religious groups had to pay extra taxes. So the Jews and the Christians had to pay supplementary extra taxes because they were not Muslims. And basically, these various groups somehow managed to cooperate with each other and get along with each other. And despite all the differences of religious belief and so on, they didn't seem to have too many religious conflicts with each other. And Suleiman was very tolerant. He, in fact, issued a decree guaranteeing Jews the right to pray without being interfered at the Western Wall. I think some people felt, why are you praying near our compound, our area where we have the Dome of the Rock and our important mosque? And Suleiman said, no, they can pray at the wall as long as they don't go into the compound, don't go up into the Temple Mount. That was more restricted and so on. Okay, so that's the basic situation of Jerusalem. But what about back in Europe? As you could see from the map I showed you, there was always tremendous interest in Jerusalem for all the reasons I mentioned. In Europe, people were very interested. Jerusalem was the center of the world. People wanted to know about it. They wanted to find out about it. They wanted to hear about it. And the very same atlas that I showed you that map from also had pictures of cities. Now, if this was done in Germany, and if it was a German city, there was a reasonable chance that the picture of the city looked reasonably much like the actual city. Well, no one who worked on this atlas had ever been to Jerusalem, so they sort of imagined what Jerusalem looked like. First of all, this is 1493. This is before Suleiman built that wall. But they just assumed that such an important city must have a wall around it, because every city does. So they put a wall around Jerusalem. They also had reports that there was a very beautiful building on the Temple Mount with a beautiful dome. So they put that right at the center of the picture. But they didn't call it Dome of the Rock or whatever that would have been in Latin. They called it the Temple of Solomon. As far as they were concerned, it was a new building that was on the site of the Temple of Solomon and should be called the Temple of Solomon. They knew that it wasn't the original temple, but it should be called the Temple of Solomon. And so you can see that the Dome of the Rock is labeled as the Temple of Solomon, and they imagined a wall system. Now, about 80 years later, 70 years later, a different group of geographers, Mr. Herr Braun and Herr Hogenberg, created a new atlas, an updated atlas with pictures of all sorts of cities. And they, I think, had slightly more updated information about Jerusalem. They showed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, of course, and they had maybe a faintly better sense of how the Dome of the Rock was situated on this separate temple platform, you might say. But they also called it the Temple of Solomon. It was just the idea that it should have been the Temple of Solomon, and by golly, that's what they were going to call it, even if it was temporarily being used by another religious community for other purposes. And of course, artists in those days were very interested in the main Christian shrine, and this is an attempt by an Italian artist in some totally different publication to illustrate the appearance of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which basically recognizes it's got some accurate features to it. They must have seen some pictures, some illustrations, some drawings or sketches that people brought to Italy. But it just becomes a big feature of the dome of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the domes. But they made it look more elegant than it really was because it was such an important site. Okay, pilgrims were interested in going to Jerusalem. You could be a map maker in Europe and never have the aspiration to see the cities whose pictures you were making. It's hard to travel. I mean, this is 1500 something, you know. Traveling is done. A lot of people traveled, but it wasn't as easy as it may be in later times. But there were pilgrims who were going to overcome all the obstacles to traveling by going on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Jews and Christians and Muslims all went on pilgrimages to Jerusalem. And there's some of them went there and prayed there and came home, and some of them went there and prayed there and didn't make it home, and whatever happens to pilgrims in a complicated situation. But I want to just confine myself to giving 2 examples of pilgrims who went to Jerusalem but came home and then wrote up their experiences, had a record of what they saw and did there. One was Jewish and one was Christian. We don't know what he looked like, but we know that this was a very wealthy and a very well-educated man named Sholom, who lived in the Italian city of Volterra. He was a merchant. He actually was a very successful merchant. He had some commercial dealings with the famous Medici family of Florence. He was very religious at the same time, and he, at some point, we don't know why, took a vow. I take a vow that I am going to go to Jerusalem. And he did that. He arranged for passage to Jerusalem on ships that were going to the Mediterranean, and he kept a detailed diary, and when he came home, he wrote a long account in Hebrew of his entire trip to that part of the world. And it's an enormously interesting sort. He wrote it in Hebrew, but a lot of Italian words are evidently sprinkled in because that was his everyday language. And this has been translated into various languages. Interestingly, the best complete translation is not into English, although there are English translations, but into German. But anyway, it depends on who chooses to make the effort to translate something. So what he had to say is well known, and it's all quite interesting. He traveled, I should begin by saying he first went to Cairo, where he was greeted warmly. The word had come that this wealthy and influential Italian merchant was coming to Cairo, and he was greeted by the Jewish community of Cairo, and some of the Ottoman officials took some interest in him because he was a very wealthy and very prominent merchant back in Italy. He had a great time in Cairo. Then the question was how to get to Jerusalem. That was very dangerous because there were bandits all up and down the route from Cairo to Jerusalem. You didn't just go. You had to wait till a caravan was going and then pay to be part of the, get to provide a camel for you and a camel for your servant and this and that. You had to pay quite a bit to be part of a caravan because the caravan had guards and to disperse all the bandits. So he became part of a caravan. It took about, I have it someplace in my notes, but it took about 2 weeks to get from Cairo to Jerusalem. And he did get to Jerusalem, of course, otherwise I wouldn't have been telling you about this. He got safely to Jerusalem. And what do you do when you arrive for the first time? There is actually a prayer that one is supposed to say. Jews are supposed to say a certain prayer the first time they lay their eyes on Jerusalem. Well, although he was a very devout man, since it's a prayer you only are supposed to say once in your life, he hadn't memorized it. He had a little book with him with the prayers. So the camels came over, if you've been to Jerusalem, they're the hills, and then many of us have had that experience, the first view of Jerusalem. And when he got to the top of the hill and he first saw Jerusalem, and he whipped out his little book that he brought with him, and he said that prayer. Then he took a closer look. This is what he said. I'm going to read this aloud. I think it's legible from where you are, but I'll read some of this aloud just in case where you're sitting. On Wednesday, July 29th, 1481, we reached the holy city of Jerusalem. When I observed with a bitter heart the extent of her destruction, I tore my cloak the width of a hand. And you see, this is the same gesture that's associated when a family is in mourning at the funeral. You tear a piece of clothing. He tore a piece of his cloak when he realized that what he was looking at was a significantly destroyed city. So he tore the piece of his cloak the width of a hand, and he uttered the prayer that is to be said then, which I learned from a little book that I brought with me. He brought it all the way to Jerusalem to have it there for this moment. So he had mixed emotions, the thrill of seeing Jerusalem and realizing, remember, this is before before Suleiman built the big walls. He's looking at Jerusalem, which he thought would be a beautiful golden city with a beautiful wall, and he sees that only one fragment of the wall has still survived. And as a good Jew, he doesn't blame this on the Romans or anyone else. The disaster is to be blamed on your own sins. On account of our sins, the city has no walls except on the side from which I approached the city. But anyway, he went to Jerusalem, and he was greeted by the small Jewish community there, and he began to look around. And he also somehow realized that this beautiful building with the dome at the top of the Temple Mount was to be thought of in one's mind, to be thought of as the temple, although he must have known it was a Muslim shrine. He also knew he wasn't allowed to go there. The temple is surrounded by a wall. May it in our days be quickly rebuilt and re-established as a temple. Amen. It has an extraordinarily beautiful gold-painted dome. Now, the dome of the Rock has not always been gold-painted and not always been gold leaf. It's gone through different stages. But at that point, it was at least painted gold, very high, and the Muslims have covered it with lead. And then he also noticed, you couldn't miss it, it's enormous, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. On the south side of the temple is a large and beautiful building, which is also covered by a lead roof. It's called the School of Solomon. I'm not so sure the Muslims called it the School of Solomon. They called it a mosque. But somehow in his mind, that's what these buildings were understood to be, however they were temporarily being used. And he made all sorts of observations, mixed observations. The buildings of Jerusalem are very beautiful. The building stones are larger than what he'd ever seen in Italy. And then he has an interesting statement. I'll read this aloud, although you can see it yourself. This is the land of milk and honey, even though the city is in the hills and finds itself in a devastated and ruined condition. Everything is readily available, and the produce is excellent. He ate well in Jerusalem. And maybe people here have eaten well in Jerusalem. I don't know. I guess I have. The food was fine, but the buildings, and some of the buildings were very impressive, but the city as a whole made a very ruined condition because it was a much larger city that had been reduced to a much smaller population, and there were all sorts of abandoned buildings. And then he made some anthropological observations about local customs. The Muslims, as well as the local Jews, behave like swine when they eat, because they all eat with their fingers from a common bowl. Now, there were vast civilizations all over Asia where it's perfectly normal to eat with your fingers. And it's only his European prejudices that made him thought that was a piggy way of eating. And many of us, if you've traveled to Asia, I've been to India a number of times, that's how many people eat there, and they eat beautifully. I mean, but anyway, he was prejudiced. On the other hand, their clothing is clean. Glad to hear that. Anyway, after having spent a few weeks in Jerusalem, actually part of the time he was sick when he was in Jerusalem, but he was well enough to be there to have seen so much. And eventually, his time as a pilgrim, he'd seen all the sights he wanted to see and said all the prayers. He also went out to some of the shrines outside Jerusalem. He was there for a number of weeks, was sick partly, then got better. And but he did go to the tomb of King David, the tomb of the Samuel, and all the other great prophets, and said prayers, and he'd finished all that, and then he headed home. And that was also a little bit adventurous. He had some episodes getting to, I'll pick that up later, he had some episodes getting to Egypt when there'd been almost a shipwreck and so on, and they were worried about pirates and so on. But eventually, Meshulam managed to get back to Jaffa, and then he went by ship to Beirut, and then took a side trip to Damascus, and then back to Beirut, which I think he found Damascus a more impressive city than Jerusalem. And then he went back, took him 7 weeks from Beirut to Venice, from which he then went back to Volterra and sat down and wrote his whole report. Oh yeah, don't worry about that, I'll find that. Thanks. Thank you. So the other pilgrim I'm going to mention is a Christian pilgrim. And he was an English Protestant. And he looked like this. His name was Henry Mondrell. Mondrell was, he didn't have to go all the way from England. I mean, his route was easier because he started in England, but he was already in Aleppo. So his pilgrimage only had to be from Aleppo to Jerusalem, which of course made it much easier. The thing with Mondrell was, he was already in Aleppo. Aleppo was a great trading outpost of an English trading company called the Levant Company. This was one of those trading companies. We know all about this from Canadian history. It was like the Hudson's Bay Company. You get a charter from the king to have the right to trade and be the exclusive English traders in a certain region. And this Levant Company got a charter from the king to do all the trading of English goods based in Aleppo, which was a big commercial center. And they, they were all English Protestants. They needed a chaplain, and they hired this guy to come from England to be their chaplain, lead the services. And he was a Church of England chaplain, and then he, in 1697, he and about a dozen other people from Aleppo, English people, decided to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And when he came back, he'd had such an interesting time. He wrote up his experiences. Friends of his in England persuaded him that they'd like to publish this, so he sent these manuscripts to England where it got published, but sadly he never saw the printed version because he died in Aleppo before the printed version of his pilgrimage experience had ever been placed in his hands. But anyway, we know what he experienced. They arrived in Jerusalem March 1697. They got a chance to sleep. They got bed and breakfast at the home of the French consul. The French were very interested in Jerusalem, and they had a permanent or semi-permanent representative there. But no, they were able to sleep in the residence of the French consul, but they got their meals at a nearby Franciscan monastery. And he got along very well with these Catholics, these Franciscans. He thought they were very nice. They served very good meals. They were very courteous to him. He had a much better impression of them than he did of the Eastern Orthodox Christians, partly for reasons I'll explain. So they arrived at the beginning of the Easter season. So, of course, there were very many services going on at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, at the pinnacle of the Christian annual year. And, of course, he attended all these services. He couldn't really worship there because he was a Protestant and there were no Protestant chapels. But he got an impression of what the church was like. He thought the church was quite impressive, but he noticed the endless wrangling. Even at Easter, all these different groups were fighting with each other about who could do what at which chapel and who could light candles and who couldn't and this and that. And he was really quite disgusted by some of what he saw. The great prize contended for by the several sects is the command and appropriation of the Holy Sepulchre, a privilege contested with so much unchristian fury and animosity that they sometimes proceed to blows and wounds even at the very door of the sepulchre. So he was quite disenchanted with what he saw there. And then at Easter, there's a special ceremony, that's still taking place. Obviously, the little pictures I have there are from the present day. And there are, there's a miracle of the holy fire that continues, by the way, to take place on Easter Sunday. Still does. Somehow, at a certain point, a flame appears in the church. Miraculously, a flame appears. And then people use this flame to ignite a whole chain of candles and torches and so on. But there seem to be some difficulties about this flame, because he and his friends, we went to see the function of the holy fire. This is a ceremony kept up by the Greeks and the Armenians. When the glimmering of the holy fire was seen or imagined to appear, Bedlam itself never saw such an unruly transport as was produced by the mob at this sight. So he is quite disenchanted by the experience, which should have been an emotional highlight for this guy. Easter, after all, going to the place of the crucifixion and the resurrection at Easter should have been like a highlight of his life, and all he saw was this wrangling and fighting and arguing and disputing. But anyway, he got back to Aleppo and sadly died before his report got published. I want to talk for a moment about stuff that was going on meanwhile in Europe. Because there were lots of people in Europe who never hoped or expected to go personally to Jerusalem, but were fascinated by special aspect of Jerusalem. Many European intellectuals of the period I'm talking about, 16th and 17th century, were enormously interested in the design of the temple, specifically the original first temple of Solomon, which they believed God had instructed Solomon exactly how to build the temple. And those instructions are familiar to many of us from the first book of Kings and from the second book of Chronicles in our Tanakh, which is also, of course, the first 3/4 of the Christian Bible. And there are these detailed descriptions of the outer porch and the main structure and the Holy of Holies and the exact measurements and cubits and this and that, and descriptions of the doors and the ornamentation. But the books are on slight disagreement on some points, so different scholars kept trying to figure out what exactly did the Temple of Solomon really look like. And an Italian French scholar here, François Valtable, came up with this picture of what he thought the Bible explained about the Temple of Solomon. But there was a further complication, because in the third book of the Bible, in the book of Ezekiel, the prophet describes a vision he had of a great temple, which was so much like this description of the Temple of Solomon. It must have been the Temple of Solomon, but the details are different. But this is also Holy Scripture. So there were other scholars who said that should have been the correct basis for trying to come up with what the temple looked like. A Spanish Jesuit scholar named Villalpando spent decades working on this based on the book of Ezekiel and reconciling it with what there was in Kings and Chronicles, and came up with this very detailed descriptions from different angles and so on, so much so that a German craftsman decided to make a model, a wooden model of Villalpando's version of what the Temple of Solomon must have looked like, and made this whole beautiful model, which is now in a museum in Hamburg. Here's a close-up of the central section. So you can go to Hamburg and see this wooden model from the 17th century of what the temple of Solomon's original temple looked like. And one thing it did not look like was the Dome of the Rock, obviously. One more scholar who is also interested in this whole issue of what did the temple look like was Isaac Newton. And we think of Isaac Newton as one of the great scientists of the 17th century, but we have to remember he was also profoundly religious and spent much of his time not developing the theories that became the foundation for much of modern physics, but developing theories about the Bible and things you read in the Bible. So he also came up, he didn't build a wooden model, but he came up with his detailed description of the floor plan of the Temple of Solomon. So people in Europe who are not ever planning to go to Jerusalem, this is, again, they haven't forgotten about Jerusalem. It's just not a place they're going to go. We haven't forgotten about. What we're looking at is Jerusalem. And we're moving on to the 18th century. We're now in the 18th century. And the 18th century, an Italian artist, and it's not clear to me whether he'd ever been there or just worked on the basis of pictures and illustrations he'd seen, but it's an Italian artist with a German background, I guess, who did this strange picture of Jerusalem in which the Dome of the Rock is subsidiary and the main focus is the domes of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is odd because the Jerusalem skyline is not dominated by those domes. It's dominated by what's at the top of the Temple Mount. But anyway, that's what he thought. But when we're in the 18th century, that moves us on to a very important character in world history whose career began at the end of the 18th century and went over on into the 19th century. And that is Napoleon Bonaparte. Because Napoleon Bonaparte was in Egypt was sent to Egypt by the French government, the French revolutionary government. Remember, he didn't start out being the emperor. He started out being a very smart soldier who became promoted to a general, won a lot of victories in Italy. And now the French government ordered General Bonaparte to go to the Middle East to fight against the English, who had a fleet in Egypt, and he wanted to defeat the land army that the English had landed in Egypt, because they had their eye on Egypt, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, to solidify the contact with India and so on. And Bonaparte should try to defeat a British army in Egypt, which he had some success with, but then they got away from him, and he chased the British up into the Levant, up into Syria, and Palestine and Syria, and he laid siege to a local governor of the part of Palestine whose headquarters was the city of Acre, who had support from the English. Napoleon was sure he would defeat the English, and then he'd be the master of Palestine. And that gave rise to an interesting idea. Having defeated the local governor of that part of Palestine, who reported to the Ottomans, Napoleon thought, once I defeat him, I will take my army to Jerusalem. And he had a very interesting idea, that he was going to return Jerusalem to what he considered the rightful owners of Jerusalem. And he was so sure that as soon as he defeated the governor of Acre, and that meant the British would have to give up and send their armies home to England, he could then march to Jerusalem. And he had written the proclamation he was going to issue when he conquered Jerusalem. And I'm going to read this aloud again in case you missed some of the words. It's addressed to the Jews of the world. He's addressing this proclamation to the Jews of the world. Israelites, arise with gladness, ye exiled. A war unexampled in the annals of history offers you at this very time, and contrary to all expectations, of course, Israel's patrimony. The young army with which Providence has sent me hither has made Jerusalem my headquarters, rightful heirs of Palestine. France calls on you not to conquer your patrimony, nay, only to take over that which has been conquered, and to remain master of it, and to maintain it against all comers. Just imagine if he'd won the Battle of Acre and had marched to Jerusalem, he was going to issue this proclamation, tell the Jews all over the world, come here, I'm giving you this city, take it over, it's yours, you can thank me. But it didn't develop that way. He didn't win the Battle of Acre. His army was marooned there, and there were political developments in France that he got on a ship, making his subordinates very angry, by the way. He got on a ship and went back to France and got mixed up in the politics there, and eventually this led to his becoming first consul, and then he became sole consul, and then he became emperor, and there's a long story I'm not going into. But imagine how different history would have been if he had been successful in taking control of Jerusalem and issuing it. I'm not suggesting anyone knows how it would have played out, but things would have been different. Anyway, Jerusalem is still under the control of the Ottoman Empire. It's still a sleepy city. It's still not much is happening in Jerusalem. However, I'm just taking a moment's break here. I've gone through a lot of centuries. Only 2 more centuries to go. And the second one, I'm going to go through very briefly. A lot of interesting things start happening in the 19th century. Basically, the first few decades, the Ottomans start asserting themselves a little more directly. The number of Arab rulers had ruled on their behalf, and they try to assert their control. But a lot of other things happen. One thing is transportation is getting easier in the 19th century. Step-by-step transportation is getting easier. Railways only come to this part of the world in the 1890s or 1880s and 1890s, but ship transportation is faster and more reliable. The roads are getting a little better. All sorts of people start coming to Jerusalem. Foreign diplomats take more and more interest in Jerusalem for reasons we'll talk to. Christian missionaries start arriving to convert whoever they find that isn't Christian, without much success, but they do what they can. Christian pilgrims come, sometimes just to worship there, sometimes to stay, but it's easier to get to Jerusalem. Travel is easier. And there's more and more tourism. And the difference between tourists and pilgrims is sometimes a little fluid. Pilgrims who are also touristically inclined, tourists who are religiously inclined, whatever. And above all, gradually in the late part of the 19th century, there's more and more Jewish immigration to Palestine and specifically to Jerusalem. So things are starting to change in Jerusalem. And one consequence is that all sorts of new structures and new areas develop. But before that's happening, I just want to quote one more famous traveler. This is Mark Twain, the famous American humorist and author, who went on a big tour, really an organized tour. This was possible. In the 1860s, he went on an organized cruise, you might say. Ship started in New York and went to the Mediterranean and stopped in France and stopped in Italy and then went to Istanbul and the Black Sea and then went to Haifa, I think, or Jaffa, probably Haifa, from which they then went to Jerusalem. And he then went home and he sent reports. One way he financed his trip was he sent reports to a magazine that published his weekly or semi-weekly reports. And it was eventually all gathered into a book known as Innocents Abroad. But what he writes, he was fascinated by Jerusalem, but very disheartened by it. He was very intrigued by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He was horrified by what he saw, all these competing groups. But on the other hand, he had been raised as a Christian, as a Protestant. He was quite intrigued by all that. But this is what he said near the end of the book. He said, "Renowned Jerusalem, the stateliest name in history, has lost all its ancient grandeur and has become a pauper village. The riches of Solomon are no longer there to compel the admiration of visiting Oriental queens. The wonderful temple, which was the pride and the glory of Israel, is gone." He was rather disappointed by Jerusalem. But despite all that, a lot's happening. There were particularly many Russian pilgrims, some of whom just wanted to see Jerusalem and go home. Others wanted to settle there. And the Russian government got involved and actually established a compound primarily as a hospice for Russian pilgrims, whether they were short-term or long-term. There was no room for this in the old city. It had to be outside the walls. The bandit problem had been brought under much more control. They weren't so worried about being outside the walls. All the Western governments, there had been a French representative in Jerusalem for centuries, but all the major Western governments felt there are things going on in Jerusalem. We should have a representative there. They had their ambassadors who went to Istanbul, of course, but they had consuls, in various other cities. They felt Jerusalem was getting important. They should have a consul in Jerusalem. And just as an example, this is the American consulate in the old city near the Jaffa Gate. And the French and the British and the Germans and so on all had consulates there. And they also had to support the work of archaeologists. A lot of archaeologists were running around Jerusalem in the 19th century. And if you were a French archaeologist, the French consul would support you and so on. There were German pilgrims. There was a Protestant group in Germany called the Templars who decided they should settle and stay in Palestine. They mostly established their colonies near Haifa or Jaffa, but some of them established a colony, a pilgrim colony, a permanent pilgrim colony in the outskirts of Jerusalem, and their cemetery has survived. And because they were Germans, that became an area outside the walls of Jerusalem known as the German colony. The Germans got very interested in Jerusalem. None less than the Kaiser, William II, decided that he was very imperial-minded and he wanted to show his importance. So he came with a big, large entourage to Jerusalem in 1898. On stopping, interestingly, he first went to Istanbul, where, by the way, he met Theodor Herzl in Istanbul. And Herzl said, "My next stop is Jerusalem." And Kaiser William said, "Yeah, I'm going there too." So they met again in Jerusalem. He was quite sympathetic in some ways to what Herzl was proposing, but not. The main thing was that they built this whole special arch for him, and he had a grand entrance into Jerusalem where it was greeted by the local dignitaries because he was such an important person. But he wanted people to keep remembering that the Germans were interested in Jerusalem. So with German funding, a great hospital was built up in the Mount of Olives area, named after the Kaiser's wife. The Augusta Victoria Hospital, which still exists, by the way, but it's not run by Germans anymore. It's a specialty hospital in the area, overlooking the city of Jerusalem. Then a few years later than all this is when World War I begins. And that, of course, is totally transformative for Palestine, for that part of the Middle East, and for Jerusalem, because the Ottoman leadership made what turned out to be an unfortunate decision to side with Germany in the war. And as the British, therefore, were engaged in fighting the Ottoman Empire, while at the same time trying very hard to get control of this part of the Middle East, because they had the Suez Canal, and if they controlled Palestine, then not only they already controlled Egypt, by the way, indirectly, unofficially, Egypt was almost like a British protectorate. And if they had Palestine that was also under British control, they could really feel secure about the Suez Canal. Meanwhile, there was the Arab revolt. The British sent Colonel Lawrence of Arabia, to help the Arabs rise up against the Ottomans. And in connection with all this, a British general, I should have mentioned this already, I forgot to show you this map. This is just to make clear how Jerusalem is spreading beyond the old walls of the old city into the surrounding area. Jerusalem is 1900, a city of 45,000 with 28,000 Jews. It's also, by the time of the First World War, that population has almost doubled. Jerusalem is getting bigger and bigger. And getting back to the story about World War I, the British win some campaigns. General Allenby gets control of the area of Palestine around Jerusalem, and eventually all of Palestine, the famous moment when General Allenby enters Jerusalem in the year 1917, and the British take control of Palestine. But things have to be organized after the war. Now, that's the history of Jerusalem, what I call the forgotten centuries. Beginning certainly by the beginning of the 20th century, nothing is forgotten about the history of Jerusalem. So the last 5 minutes of what I'm going to talk about is stuff you already know. But just to sort of wrap things up, the British have gotten control of Palestine. The League of Nations will declare Britain as having a mandate control of Palestine on things get sorted out. So for 20 years, the British mandate of Palestine was on the other side of the Jordan, the Kingdom of Transjordan is developed. That only lasts till 1948, when, as you know, you have the Israeli War of Independence. I won't tell you the history of that. You're familiar with that. We just know that following the Israeli War of Independence, Israel, the new state of Israel, controls all the areas granted to them under the UN partition, plus the areas they conquered. And when the armies of 5 Arab countries had attacked the new state of Israel, and what they didn't take over is now it's annexed to the Kingdom of Jordan, but Jerusalem itself, as we all know, became a divided city. And the part controlled by the Jews, West Jerusalem, is on one side. The part controlled by the Arab armies remains under the control of Jordan, and the old city is part of what's controlled by the Kingdom of Jordan for a little under 20 years. Then, of course, there is the Six-Day War, the famous moment when Israeli army conquers the old city of Jerusalem. This picture has been criticized by some Jewish intellectuals because why did this soldier take his head covering off at the wall? That wasn't Jewish. Well, they'd just been in the middle of hand-to-hand fighting, and it probably was hot and sweaty, and he took his helmet off. So we can talk about that, but we won't. Anyway, the point is that this is really probably the most famous picture that emerged from the Six-Day War, because there they are, the Jewish soldiers standing at the wall, and that has led to the situation we are familiar with now, the West Bank fully under Israeli control, but it's also under the control in certain districts of the Palestine Authority, the Golan Heights, the Gaza. This is the situation that exists today. And Jerusalem, through the actions of the Six-Day War, has become a politically united city. I refer to it as politically united. Here's the Jerusalem today, huge city of 1 million. Many very important institutions have emerged. All those, the Knesset and the government buildings and the Israel Museum and so on are all over in the more western part of Jerusalem. It's a politically and administratively united city, but on another level, it's not a united city because, as we also know, there is, in demographic terms, a tremendous difference between West Jerusalem, which is overwhelmingly Jewish, and East Jerusalem, which is overwhelmingly Arab. And it's a very difficult and contentious city today. But that takes us right to the present. I have managed to keep this down to 59 minutes, just by my count. And I'll be happy to stick around for questions, but I've managed to get through many centuries of Jerusalem's history, and I hope you found this interesting.
Yeah. Questions? Don't be shy.
Mine is very simple. What is the Holy Sepulchre?
Oh, sepulchre is an old-fashioned word for tomb, for a grave. Yeah, it's, you know, I thought of that when I was there. I would have taken another 30 seconds. I should have answered that question in the course of that. A sepulchre is a word we never use today, but it's an old-fashioned word for tomb. And if the Christians believed that they had found the spot where there was the cave where the body of Jesus had been laid, and they built this to represent the tomb, but it's also that site is supposed to represent where the crucifixion took place. The two things are very close together. That was a good question because it had a clear answer.
Chris, thank you very much. That was a really good talk. I wondered whether during the period where the Jews were re-inhabiting Jerusalem, what was known about the population and the demographics in Europe?
Well, you mean in the 19th century?
Yeah.
The 19th century is a period when there was much more information available than it had been a few centuries earlier. People, in the 19th century is a period in European history of enormous progress in terms of scientific methods and so on, and also many, many more European scientists and archaeologists were going to Jerusalem, and they knew pretty much the details about Jerusalem that 2 or 3 centuries earlier would have been very hard for Europeans to find out. So the way the records of the population growth of Jerusalem were pretty well known for the 19th century. Before that, it's not that we don't know at all, because the Ottoman Turks had kept very careful taxation records. So from that, it's easy to calculate how many families there were, and that's how many people there were likely to have been. But the Ottomans didn't share their tax data with Europeans. 19th century, these things were much easier to find out.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, right here, Sheila.
The slide that you had showing Schott's depiction of his drawing of what the, I think it said Solomon's Temple, the 3 tiers of buildings that had like that, that looked to me very much like when you go into Petra and you see the treasury has those the same frontage.
Well,
And I'm wondering if they did that for all important buildings at that time.
well, it's a very interesting. So this question is, why would the Spanish experts' version of the temple, and that was then adopted by the German craftsmen, look so much like classical architecture? And the Petra, I've never been to Petra. I wish I had been sometime, but I must be spectacular. But Petra is a product of the classical era, where the Greco-Roman architectural style was being adopted all over the Mediterranean. But the 16th and 17th century in Europe, where they had put the Gothic style behind them, and the dominant style of grand architecture was neoclassical, also based on Roman style. So these scholars and craftsmen are thinking, they're trying to go from the biblical information, how many cubits and what's on top of what, and thinking, well, what kind of embellishments would there be? They just were thinking in neoclassical terms, because that was the idiom that was customary in European grand architecture. They weren't thinking, maybe Solomon was before the Roman and Greeks had influenced that part. They weren't thinking in those terms. They knew what a beautiful building looked like, neoclassical architecture. Great, I'd never thought about that. That's a great question. Got me thinking.
Chris,
Wait,
we're used to.
wait a minute. I need to know. Someone raise your hand.
Sorry.
Oh, you're way over there, and I just didn't know where the question was coming from.
Okay, we are, I say we, so I think most of us are used to using the terms Islam and Muslim almost interchangeably, whereas you don't use it interchangeably at all.
Islam, all right. Islam is the term for the religion, just as Judaism is the term for the Jewish religion. Muslims is the term for adherents of the religion. People who are believers in Islam would refer to themselves as Muslims, but it's also an adjective that you would apply to, say, Muslim architecture, Muslim beliefs, and so on. So Islam and Muslim I would regard as being different forms of parts of speech, practically, that refer to the same thing.
But you were using Muslim for people who lived maybe a couple thousand years ago.
Well, since 16...
But Islam, you use the date 16 something.
No, I would say that though, when I was talking in this lecture, I wasn't really paying that much attention to which term I was using, but Islam, the religion of Islam, was founded very rapidly by the Prophet Muhammad in the years of around 1630 of the Common Era. Around 630. There was right. Oh, I hope I didn't say 16. That would be 1,000 years off. Sorry about that. Well, that little one there was in my head. I don't know why. In the 7th century, around the year 630 of the Common Era, the Prophet Muhammad founds a religion that I think ever since then has been referred to as Islam. It has the connotation of submission to God. And the adjective that goes with that is Muslim. And that started at the same time. But it's very important to be clear about that.
Okay, we're going to take one question more.
Thank you. I wanted to know if there was any leftover from the Muslims, the Turks, when they came to Israel. I was born in 1945, and in school they used to say that they were not allowed to build during the daytime. So they had to build, the Turks told them they can build only during the nighttime. So there are a lot of buildings that fell apart that did not create, and so that's the only thing I remember. But anyway, I just wanted to say that I happen to have a great uncle that made an aliyah from Baghdad in 1920. The English, I think that by that time were kind of taking over a lot of the properties, were very kind to the Jews in Baghdad. Apparently, they were all kind of working daytime or banking or something, and my grandfather was murdered because his name was Cohen. Anyway, the English were very good to this fellow who made the aliyah to Israel. They needed somebody to become a chief judge, which he had no title, but he was a chief rabbi. So they came and asked him, would you do it? Would you go to Manchester? He says, well, if I can take my family, I will. Well, he did. So there is a street in Jerusalem and Hebron under Yehuda Mani, which is my great uncle. So something does happen.
It's a wonderful, they're two separate questions, so let me take them one at a time, because so the Ottoman Empire was a rather unwieldy empire, and it was, times it was not very effectively governed. And they governed through local officials of one sort or other. And the fact is that all through the 19th and early 20th century, different parts of the Ottoman Empire were governed in somewhat different ways. It depended on who the local bosses were and who the local officials were. And I would say that they got very interested in Jerusalem, the Ottoman officials, and they really put some effort into having very skilled and effective administrators in and around Jerusalem by the end of the 19th century, because they knew that so many foreigners were interested in Jerusalem and they wanted Jerusalem to make a good impression. That's one reason you had support by the Ottoman Turks for building a railway to Jerusalem, for building better roads, for building good aqueducts. They wanted Jerusalem to be a successful city because so many Westerners were visiting Jerusalem. They were probably much less interested in other parts of the Ottoman Empire. And if you're talking about northern part of Palestine or various other areas, there may be cases where some local Turkish official made all sorts of rules that they didn't even know about in Istanbul, whether it was you can only build things after dark or something. That's very convincing that that could have happened under the time of the Ottoman Empire, but not because someone in Istanbul made a decree that no buildings will be built by non-Muslims by daylight, but some local governor, maybe someone who was susceptible to being bribed, and said you can't build anything during the daytime, and it was waiting for, so you have to think of this as an explanation, as something that may have been very applicable in certain parts of this far-flung Ottoman Empire that the central government in Istanbul wasn't in control of. The second half is just a fascinating personal story, going back to the, people. I mean, people around today could have had grandparents who still were who started out life in the Ottoman period. Absolutely.
There were a lot of rabbis in the family, so it was automatic that somebody that was a rabbi student wanted to come to Israel. But what happened afterwards, that the British authorized him to become even further.
Yeah, fascinating.
That was something.
Well, the British policy in the initial years following the Balfour Declaration and the establishment of the mandate, British policy was very pro-Zionist and very pro-Jewish. That didn't last much beyond the 1920s. In the 1920s, there was lots of British policy making was very supportive of the Jewish element in Palestine. But that changed in the 1930s, and we...
So we have to bring the session to an end.
Too much going on
and
here.
it falls to me, Chris, to thank you so much for your presentation. Many of us here have heard... Many of us here have heard you present on more than one occasion, and while we expect a professor of history to be knowledgeable on his subject, what you bring is the ability to share that knowledge in a non-professional way with a non-professional audience. And on this particular subject, boy, I certainly learned a huge amount about forgotten years, and I think all of us here are very appreciative of the time you spend in putting it together and being with us. Hope you'll come back again.
Well, I hope so. I'll say one last thing. Many of you didn't notice this, but we had in the back row a non-human attendee to this lecture, a member of the canine family. I think that canine member of the audience was very quiet and well-behaved, but so are all of you. Thanks for your attention.
And that particular person's left, we understand that was a service dog, so normally we wouldn't allow animals in the sanctuary. And I should have mentioned as well, I have a small token of appreciation here, Chris, for you, for your presentation. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. That was nice. I need a drink. Thanks very much. Yeah.